àkọ́kọ́ nínú ètò ìròyìn wa, a ní láti mú yín kọjá lọ sí ìlú òyìnbó.
For the first time in our series, we travel to Europe, into the very heart of Europe. The reason we selected Upper Austria, of all places, is easily explained. The neighboring tribal regions of the Salzburgers or the Tyroleans have become familiar all over the world as a result of numerous films. And as we have already seen in Asia, Australia and America, an excess of interest from the outside world can destroy the original tribal customs. Up to now, Upper Austria has remained a closed book in the eyes of the world. And for this reason, we hope to be able to study the undistorted lives of the Alpine inhabitants. Much of what we discover of the Upper Austrians may also give us a clue as to the original customs and traditions of other Alpine tribes. We hesitated a long time before making our first trip to Europe, and we entertained no great hopes of expanding the frontiers of ethnological knowledge. After all, Europe is one of the best documented areas of the globe, even if these regions have up to now been described exclusively from the inside, that is to say by Europeans, with the one-sided egocentricity of the white man. The uninhibited gaze of the outsider is a totally new phenomenon. Our expectations were modest enough, and none of us could have guessed at the downright sensational ethnological material we were to take home with us. Upper Austria lies on the northern edge of that great Middle European mountain range, the Alps. No bigger than the Virunga and Ruwenzori national parks put together. But then everything in Middle Europe is small scale and cramped, often oppressively constricting. Mountain chains frequently obscure the horizon, a phenomenon reflected in the thinking of the tribes and peoples who live there. As the Pygmies say, you can only think as far as you can see. As our regular viewers will know, the large urban areas do not detain us for long. Linz, the capital, by the way, is a city like any other, similar to Lusaka, Kinshasa or Kananga, though rather smaller. We immediately set out to penetrate the interior, into regions where no black man's foot has trod. And already on the second day of our stay in Upper Austria, we attempt to make contact with the natives. This little incident hardly surprises us, since the Alpine tribes, especially those in remote valleys, are known to be timid and unapproachable. In the case of the Upper Austrians, the specialist literature even talks of a pronounced xenophobia, the causes of which, by the way, will later be made clear. In these early days, we sometimes have the feeling of advancing into an uninhabited landscape. The natives are hiding from us. It is quite eerie sometimes. Everything seems peaceful. We can't hear them, we can't see them, but we know they're there. Only occasionally does one betray his presence. We are beginning to fear that we have arrived in a totally hostile country. But at last, Edith, my assistant, succeeds in making contact with a group of children. Luckily, they are as trusting here as anywhere in the world. But if we want to explore the country off the beaten track, we shall need adults as guides and porters. We have read that all over Europe there are houses accessible to the public, so-called guest houses. And this name leads us to hope for a less xenophobic reaction.
Dicker tut's in der Fetterhosen. Schon jetzt im Leben verzage nicht.
The language of the natives is more or less incomprehensible. It is apparently related to Bavarian, according to some theories even to German. But this seems extremely unlikely.
Hat natürlich ein Schussesegler, so schön schwarze.
Spoiler, Tore.
Schön.
So gewann zugeben, oder schmierst eh gescheit.
Wir machen das schon.
Wiki,
Was? Jetzt ist dran.
Ja. Ja, ich stimme mit drunter.
Der
verblieb,
gehört
dass ich
mir.
noch-
Da. Hey!
Hey.
It turns out that the four of them are brothers. Rudolf Himmelfreund-Pointner, Sepp Himmelfreund-Pointner, Karl Himmelfreund-Pointner, and Franz Himmelfreund-Pointner. After a few days, when the Himmelfreund-Pointners have lost something of their initial suspicion of us, their anxiety to show us what they consider to be the local sights is rather touching. In many ways, we were lucky with the Himmelfreund-Pointners. They turn out to be tough and resilient, and seldom require encouragement. Of course, to think that even in this remote corner of the globe, the natives would be content with a handful of glass beads, that would be a mistake.
Nichts gut. Nichts gut. Das ist gut.
Das geht nie gut. Nie.
The idea of using the river as a means of transport, a thought that occurs naturally to us Africans, is clearly foreign to the Alpine tribes. They are earthbound and love steep, rocky mountain paths. On the water, they feel correspondingly insecure. Fortunately, however, there is not a crocodile or hippopotamus to be seen. Here we discovered evidence of a particularly idiosyncratic nature for the natives' ambivalent relationship to water. To overcome their uneasiness with the treacherous currents, they have disguised a boat as an apparently robust and reliable log cabin. In this way, the Upper Austrians can feel at home even on the water, although, as we can see here, and shall hear more of later, the degree of relaxation attained seems to depend on the level of consumption of a bitter foaming liquid known in Africa under the name of beer. From the water we observe something quite extraordinary. It is a well-documented fact that the Upper Austrians were already settled here 1,000 years ago. But this is apparently not the case. The natives we see struggling along here are not simply on the way from village A to town B. They are traveling without any particular destination, simply setting out on a journey, then turning round nowhere in particular and traveling home again. Mobility for the sake of mobility, movement as an end in itself. An inexplicable urge for a change of scenery seems to drive the people to take to the road from time to time. The trained ethnologist is forced to the conclusion that this is genuine nomadic behavior. With a difference, however, since the nomadism of the European Alps, in contrast to that of the Maasai in Kenya, for example, is not an existential life form, but merely an attitude of mind. A reflex from the past, an apparently deep-rooted but barely conscious memory of an earlier nomadic existence. Or so it seems to me. This is a phenomenon one observes time and again among the tribes of Central Europe, namely that cultural behavior which made sense at a certain stage of development in the past still flourishes today in customs which are very little understood or even reflected upon. Paul Parin's claim that white men think too much seems even more dubious in the light of this observation. In spite of all this, I would be reluctant to number myself among the many who maintain that the European peoples and tribes possess no real culture in the African sense. We know, for example, on the basis of old film material, that the Upper Austrians were certainly at one time familiar with ritual dances. The Upper Austrians dance, but they themselves seem to be totally ignorant of the significance of this dance. The formal sequences are strictly observed, but the forms themselves seem to have been emptied of any meaning. As an explorer and researcher, it is vital to be on one's guard against prejudice, and above all to remember foreign countries, foreign worlds of thought. Our African culture is a culture of masks, of song, and of dance. European culture, so we hear, is a culture of, well, for example, of the written word, and it is not for us to belittle it for that reason alone. The tradition of song is very much alive even today among the Upper Austrian tribes. The Himmelfreund-Pointner brothers, who otherwise radiate a robust, even coarse vitality, create a curiously touching atmosphere of melancholy when they sing around the campfire in the evenings. One could almost believe that the spiritual life of the Upper Austrians is more complex than appears at first sight. The songs of the younger natives, though lacking in spontaneity, have a confident, life-affirming ring to them. On the other hand, the songs sung by the older generation seem to me to be one long, heart-rending lament for the past and the sufferings of old age. We shall see later how the Upper Austrians treat their old folk. the shrill laments of the old women are occasionally spiced with scorn and derision. The Upper Austrian tribes are difficult to categorize ethnologically. Frequently one comes across descendants of the original Celtic inhabitants. Tribes originating from Slavic and Mediterranean countries also settled here and left their distinctive traces. Many different peoples have passed through in the course of time, and the exhausted and footsore have remained behind. The population is a complete mixture, racially speaking, and this fact seems to lie at the root of its xenophobia. The South African poet Breiten Breitenbach has pointed out that it is precisely the half-breeds, the bastards, who suffer from an almost pathological yearning for racial purity, for preserving the supposed purity of their blood. The Upper Austrians seem to be most closely related to the Bavarians, culturally as well, considering culture in its broadest and purely scientific sense. At any rate, it was certainly the Bavarians who introduced the religion still practiced today, Christianity, which in a modified form is also familiar to us Africans. I am standing here in one of the many Christian cult houses. The conventions of this particular type of Christianity, to which the Upper Austrian tribes still pay lip service at any rate, have been thoroughly researched. This is the Catholic version, more precisely a derivative form strongly influenced by the so-called Counter-Reformation. Like many of the other varieties we have come across, it is a syncretic religion, assembled from many disparate elements and rather impenetrable to the average African. In certain respects related to Judaism and to Islam, it differs from these two in its incorporation of the myth of the death and resurrection of a young god, though even this aspect is not an original feature, stemming as it does from the antique myths of the Mediterranean and Asia Minor, those of Dionysus, Attis, the Babylonian Tammuz, the Marsyas, and so on, fused with the Nordic legends of Odin or Wotan, who, like the vegetation gods of the Near East, died suspended on a tree in order that he should rise transmogrified from the dead. The most extraordinary claim of all, however, is that this is a monotheistic religion. In actual fact, what began as a monotheistic religion has developed into the worship of a rather bizarre collection of individual gods. The four major deities are a nameless father god, a mother deity, the young god already mentioned, often called the son of God, whose function is rather obscure and who seems to be half man, half god. And then number 4, though obviously considered very influential, a wicked god, thought to be responsible for all the evil in the world. And then we have number 5, a deity in animal form, who is theoretically on a par with the nameless god and the young one, but is in fact largely ignored by the worshippers. This one is represented as a white dove. Both the significance and the function of the young god who was hanged and resurrected seem to have undergone profound changes in the course of the centuries. he has been gradually reinterpreted from a vegetation deity worshipped with totemistic rituals into a ruling divinity, with the support of very dubious theological arguments. The administrators of the religion of this god were thus able to turn themselves into rulers. Even today, the older Upper Austrians relate that nothing could proceed in the village without the approval or permission of the spiritual leaders. A living testimony to the power of these spiritual leaders are the monumental cult houses, which stand in the center of every town and village, and are easily recognized by the towers built onto them, a feature familiar to us from the ancestral halls of Mali. Much of the religion of the Upper Austrian tribes and those related to them may seem absurd to the average African, but at the same time there are many phenomena, animistic attitudes for example, which were predominant in our culture as well until relatively recently. One often sees these little statuettes in front of the houses of Upper Austrians. They are clearly identifiable as objects of ancestral worship. Since the figures are not stylized like ours, but naturalistic, they give us a good idea of how the Upper Austrians must have looked in former centuries. We discovered this collection of skulls in the village of Hallstatt, a remote and mysterious corner of Upper Austria. Every African is, of course, immediately reminded of the charnel houses of Cassenye in Angola. In the weeks leading up to our sensational discovery, we were many times on the point of giving up our research into the spiritual life of the Upper Austrians, for at first we found scarcely any evidence of current religious practices. The magnificent old cult houses stand empty, and although some communities still carry out ceremonies inherited from their ancestors, these are half-hearted, formalistic and devoid of meaning, or simply no longer understood. There was nothing for it but to turn our attention back to the Upper Austrians' behavior this side of the grave. There's a little rhyme I'd like to recite to you. The folk of Upper Austria are difficult to spot, for sometimes they are on their own and sometimes they are not. When they are not on their own, we can observe a marked preference for music making and marching in step. This gregariousness seems, at first sight anyway, to flatly contradict what the specialist literature would have us believe to be the most basic characteristic of the European, his individualism. We must be careful never to overlook this overemphasis on the individual, so foreign to an African observer, when trying to understand the mentality of a European tribe. To set one's own interests on an equal or even superior footing to those of the family, the clan or the tribe is accepted as perfectly natural and not in any way egotistical or damaging to the community. However, the observed tendency to flock together gives the game away. Even the Upper Austrian cannot survive all the time without the safety and security afforded by the feeling of belonging to a group. Another aspect of this herd instinct is the preference for bizarre clothing, but not individually bizarre, far from it. In order to recover from the stresses and strains of individualism, the Upper Austrians are at pains to make themselves look identical, and in the most eye-catching manner. Only when they all look alike and are marching in step, bemused by the booming of the music, do they apparently begin to sense the advantages of living in a group. Another phenomenon that the African notices immediately when he first enters the densely populated regions of the Upper Austrian tribes, and one that would appear to be connected to the absolute predominance of the individual, is that there are fences everywhere. Each person seals himself off from the others. Each pursues happiness in a vacuum, as it were. The individualist apparently has to protect himself from other individualists. I would even maintain that every Upper Austrian, provided he could attend the occasional costume gathering, would prefer to live alone, in his or her own house, on his or her own thoroughly fenced-in plot of ground. In these circumstances, of course, the Upper Austrians would have died out long ago. For this reason, following the biological urges towards procreation and the care of the young, they are obliged to live in groups, though in the smallest units imaginable. At first sight, the native Upper Austrians appear to live in a state of monogamy. Only at first sight, however, for in actual fact, almost every man has several wives, although the subsidiary wives never live in the same household as the principal wife. One can thus speak of a kind of dislocated polygamy, a phenomenon which appears to have been unjustly neglected by ethnographic research. And the old people? What happens to the elderly, whose heart-rending songs of lamentation we will not have forgotten? In our last program but one, we saw how the Eskimos dispose of the older generation who have outworn their usefulness by marooning them on ice floes. Well, this is not the Upper Austrian tradition, presumably for climatic reasons, since there are very few days in the year, if any, when ice floes of sufficient size are to be found on Upper Austrian rivers. One hears rumors of so-called ancestor poisoning, but we were unable to find concrete evidence of this practice, widespread though it is reputed to be. On the other hand, we did discover the so-called old people's homes, where the aged of both sexes are thrown together, irrespective of their clan or family background, and thus concealed from the public gaze. As far as houses are concerned, most Upper Austrians live in permanent dwellings, but some in tents. As we saw in the case of the urge for mobility without a recognizable destination or defined purpose, this also is clearly a faint echo from a nomadic past. And even if tents may not seem ideally suited to the often harsh climate, the natives who inhabit them nevertheless appear to lead more contented and harmonious lives than those who prefer bricks and mortar. We discovered quite by chance the extraordinary significance of the tent in the lives of the Upper Austrians, a subject untouched in the whole of ethnological literature. In the middle of a village, a huge tent is being erected. For what purpose is initially obscure. What is clear, however, is that the entire male population of the village is lending a hand. A communal activity, carried out with markedly greater enthusiasm than a normal day's work. What is going to happen in this tent? We wait until nightfall, and then? Then the natives abandon all their mundane tasks and assemble inside the tent. Their numbers are swelled by an influx from the neighboring villages. But why have they come? The main purpose of this festival seems to be beer drinking. Yes, one must certainly call it a festival.
Michelle machine. Harmony machine, history machine. Walk on machine, Michelle machine. Harmony machine, history machine. Walk on machine, Michelle machine. Harmony machine, history machine. Eins, zwei, drei, Stufe! Die Kriege! Jawohl, die Kriege! Die Kriege! Jetzt ein Prosit, 3 und 4. Ein Prosit, der Königsgeist. Ein Prosit.
The natives drink for almost the entire night. It would be wide of the mark to describe it as a cheerful, friendly get-together. The participants of this festival seem to be under a compulsion to drink as much as they possibly can of this drink, although it doesn't seem to agree with all of them. Many become nauseous and leave the tent for a while to vomit, only to return and recommence pouring vast quantities of beer into themselves. Long after midnight, the natives return home. But early in the morning, they are back sitting in the tent. Calmer and less noisy than during the night, but there they are, as if they had to come, as if it was their duty. The activity goes on for 2 days and 3 nights, civilized by day, but orgiastic by night, until the tent is finally dismantled and the village returns to everyday life. One normally drinks when one is thirsty, or at least when one feels like it. But here there seems to be a real compulsion to drink as much as humanly possible, and anyone who evades this apparently sacred obligation places himself beyond the pale within the community. Was this a cult, which until now had been overlooked by ethnological research? Or what was it? We asked our companions, the Himmelfreund-Pointner brothers.
Das heißt gar nichts Besonderes.
Naja, zusammensitzen, da wir uns halt gern.
Und schön ist, wenn er Musik spielt.
Das Bier schmeckt uns halt.
Ja, das bedeutet nichts.
Nein, eine besondere Bedeutung hat das nicht.
Bedeutung?
Explorers must always be on their guard against the assumption that a chance occurrence is a typical one. However, the way the Himmelfreund-Pointners seem to be at pains to deny this festival any particular significance, to reduce it to an everyday occurrence, this itself convinced me more than ever that we had stumbled on a ritualistic assembly of the highest importance. After all, natives all over the world try to conceal their most important rites and cults from strangers, from the uninitiated. At first, we assumed that the rituals we had experienced were a local phenomenon. Then, another village, another tent. And on our travels through Upper Austria, parts of which we now discovered were truly unexplored, we were amazed to learn that once a year in every village, a similar mysterious gathering takes place. Almost always in a tent, but occasionally in a barn or a fire station.
ètò ìjìnlẹ̀ nípa ìlú òkè Austria.
The trained ethnological eye can rapidly identify the structure of these festivals, which has much in common with those of other cults with orgiastic tendencies in far-flung corners of the globe. It begins with a communal meal, which is followed by a phase of avowed fellowship and brotherhood. The individualistic Upper Austrians are once again seeking a feeling of community and equality, as we saw with the earlier outdoor group formation. Then, as stage 3 in a regimented pattern, comes the dance. And here we find nothing of the formal sterility that we found so puzzling on the old archive material. Finally, and this was also a minor sensation, we managed to capture some footage of a kind of ritual courtship dance, which appears to have been taken over from neighboring tribes rather than being original Upper Austrian, as I deduced from archive film in Kinshasa. It seems quite clear that the youths are using a variety of grotesque movements and gestures to attract the young women and incite them to coitus. On the evening we were filming this ritual, the young Austrian women did not appear to be ready for copulation. Indeed, they were dancing primarily with each other. Whether one can draw conclusions from this about the sexual customs of the Upper Austrian tribes is a moot point. To return to the formal structure of these ritual festivals, The climax approaches with orgiastic, if not specifically sexual, exuberance. The participants have danced and drunk themselves into a trance. There is now no trace of the ponderousness one generally attributes to the Alpine tribes. They are, as it were, outside themselves. They have crossed the narrow confines of their own personality, a typical feature of the trance-like state aspired to by so many cults in so many countries of the world.
Lasset uns beten.
I must mention one other indication of the unmistakably religious character of these events.
Vorsicht, Kamera. Man wird Heigen ein wenig verkühlt oder was? Die Schäume
Jesu Kindlein, bleib bei mir, trink ein Glas Wein mit mir. Mein Herz ist klein, der Durst ist groß. Jesu Kindlein, Prost.
A prayer. There can be no doubt of it. And, let it be noted, the prayer is addressed to the wine. Now, we know that wine plays an important role in Christian ritual. To understand this role, we must take stock for a moment.
Gẹ́gẹ́ bí mo ti ṣe sọ ní àkọ́kọ́.
I have already referred to totemism as one of the elements making up the natives' religious world of the imagination.
Ìyẹn ni mo fẹ́ kí ẹ jẹ́ kí ó yé wa.
The execution of the young god is understood as a sacrificial death. So far, so good. More difficult to understand is the explanation of the necessity for this sacrifice. That is, that the nameless father deity had been offended by mankind and could only be appeased through the murder of his own son. This sounds abstruse, I know, but we must remember that there are guilt feelings involved here. And how do they celebrate the memory of the sacrificial death of the young god? Every African at all familiar with totemism will guess the answer immediately. Through a communal meal at which the young god is consumed by the community. They eat his flesh and drink his blood. A totemistic meal, in other words. The memory of a murder committed by the community. Its ritual reenacting from time to time to cement the social bonds between the guilty. All that is familiar to us. We cannot be certain whether in ancient times it was really a human being who was killed and eaten on each occasion, or whether the substitution of an animal sacrifice was there from the beginning. The totem animal was in all events a lamb, and the young god who was hanged is often referred to nowadays as the Lamb of God. It is interesting, though, that the food consumed at the ritual festival is not lamb, but bread. Among the treasures of the anthropological film archives at Kinshasa, we found some interesting material. The ritual communal meal. The food is a lamb made of bread dough, bread as a substitute for flesh, and wine is drunk as blood. Let us set down what we know for sure. The old stone cult buildings stand empty, and instead the people assemble in tents for their rituals. And here it is no longer wine that is drunk, but beer. Although the formal structure of these festivals was soon clear to us, several weeks later we were still no nearer to discovering the deeper significance behind the remarkable changes in these rites.
Ní àwọn ọ̀sẹ̀ àkọ́kọ́,
We had already decided that the puzzle was destined to remain unsolved when Malik, who works alternately with me as cameraman on our expeditions, showed us a recording he had made. It was an interesting curiosity, but he had seen no particular significance in it. Let's examine it for a moment. At first, I too could make nothing much of this curious old man with a cock on his head.
So geht das nicht. Gut aufgeladen, voller Erfolg. Achtung. Mach dich fertig. So. So geht das nicht. Gut aufgeladen, voller Erfolg.
The old man talks about recharging, storing energy. Could this apparently insignificant little scene be a ritual of its own? An animal cult? The cock as the new sacrificial beast? Earlier, the communal consumption of the lamb, now the communal consumption of the chicken. We Africans know only too well that the chicken is ideally suited to function, psychologically speaking, as a projection surface for religious ideas. One only has to think of the voodoo cults, for example. There must also have been an inclination towards cockerel worship in the Alps in former times, as one sees images of the bird on the towers of cult houses, dating back many centuries, and also inside the houses. Chance had guided us onto the right track, and once we had found the track, the solution to the problem was quite simple. The sacrificial lamb had indeed been replaced by the sacrificial chicken. As soon as we knew what to look for, we found numerous indications amounting to an impressive body of evidence. Chickens seem to be the most popular of all domestic animals. There are more of them than any of the other animals tamed by the Upper Austrians. The chicken also plays a significant role in the verbal metaphors of the common folk, as an old peasant told us.
Der Herr stolzieren wie ein Gockelhahn.
Strutting like a cock.
Ein guter Hahn wird selten fett. Ja, und das wünscht sich eigentlich jeder Mann. Hahn im Korb sein.
What every man would like to be. Cock of the walk.
Dann gibt es noch eine alte Bauernregel, und die besagt,
An old peasant proverb. When the cock crows on the dung heap, the weather will change or stay as it is.
Ja, gibt so schöne Sprüche. Ein altes Sprichwort fällt mir da auch noch ein.
Another
Ja.
old proverb.
Das bezieht sich auf die Händeln, gell? Händeln.
Even a blind chicken sometimes finds the corn.
Das Huhn findet auch manchmal ein Korn. Und dann gibt's noch was Gutes.
Just as we talk of a bone to pick with someone, the Upper Austrians say, I have a chicken to pluck with you.
Ja, mit den Hühnern ins Bett gehen.
And they also talk of going to bed with the chickens.
ó dàbí ẹni wípé
A tremendous cultural upheaval seems to be taking place here, and one which poses a major challenge to ethnological research.
akẹ́kọ̀ọ́ ti ẹ̀tọ́ ìjìnlẹ̀
We know which of the principal divinities have been abandoned or neglected, but we do not as yet know to which deity to assign the new totem animal.
ṣùgbọ́n a kò mọ
The god in the form of a dove suggests itself immediately, but the transference from bird to bird is unlikely to be so simple.
ti ẹyẹlé
For the present, this question will have to remain unanswered.
eléyìí nítorí náà ìbéèrè yìí a ṣì ń láti fi kọ́ sí orí àkọ́ láì ní ìdáhùn sí.
But we do have one final piece of evidence of chicken worship. A dance, which we observed at many of the tent festivals, which at first was a complete enigma to us. The dancers mimic the beating of a chicken's wings. White theologians would call it imitatio Dei. One identifies with the chicken, one feels at one with the totem animal, and thus with the god which it represents.
nǹkan tí ojú wa rí
What
ní
we were privileged to witness in Upper Austria was nothing less than a change of religious paradigm,
ìpadà àṣà ẹ̀
perhaps even the emergence of a new religion.
a lè pè é ní
We were able to fill in a blank on the ethnological world map. With the help of scientific acumen, I think I may say in all modesty, but of course luck, which should never be scorned by the researcher, also played its part. We freely admit that many other puzzles remain unsolved, and there are undoubtedly areas of the native psyche of distant Upper Austria which will never be laid bare.
màá kí yín, ẹ kú ìrọ̀lẹ́. Ó dẹ̀
Have a
di
nice
ìgbà
evening,
náà. Nígbà
and all the
tí
best
a bá ti
until we
padà
see you again
ètò ìròyìn
with
wa.
more strange peoples, strange customs. See the world with Kayonga Kagame.